Thanks for downloading this episode of Cork Talk with me, Tim Atkin. A weekly conversation with some of the most famous people in the world of wine.
This podcast is brought to you in partnership with Noma Cork by Vineyards. Driven by a commitment to innovation, the new plant-based Noma Cork Green Line offers significant improvements in wine closure performance. Thanks to a rigorous oxygen ingress rate, you can decide which cork is best for your wine, whether it's for young and fresh wines or for those with ageing potential.
Author of Vineyards, Rocks and Soils, Professor Alex Maltman is an expert on wine geology. I caught up with him from his home in Aberystwyth to talk about his life's work. Our in-depth chat covered earthquakes, Welsh Seyval Blanc, different types of rocks, his definition of the French word terroir, the unseen factors that affect vinous aromas and flavours, and why geology is so often misunderstood by people in the wine business. Hello, Alex, and welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Tim. Pleasure to be here talking with you.
I can't wait to learn so much from you about geology. I mean, I love your book. I love your articles. And you have this amazing knack of being able to communicate very complex things to ignoramuses like me who don't know that much about science. So
Well, let's hope that happens now then. I don't know. Can I just say that it is a privilege for me to be here with you because I have looked at the galaxy of wine maestros that you've had podcasts before. Yeah, and a privilege for me to be here. That's great. Thank you.
You deserve to be among them. And you're in Wales right now. You're in Aberystwyth, where you spent, 50 years of your life. Were you born in Wales as well? Are you Welsh?
I was born in York in the north of England, and I spent the first 18 years of my life there in York. It wasn't the tourist honeypot in those days that it is now, but I loved the place, had a great time. My father was Scottish, so I spent time in Scotland, which I also loved. But yes, I'm essentially a Yorkie, though it's a long, long time since I left the place.
And what got you interested in geology? I mean, was it walking around the Dales or going up to the Highlands or something, or what?
Well, I did a lot of cycling because York is a great centre for cycling. And I don't know why, but I always noticed the landscape and wondered why hills were where they were and things like that. And the old story, I had a good teacher. There was a chap at school, at grammar school, that taught a bit of geology, and I just got hooked. So there was no question when it was time to go to university, that's what I wanted to do, geology, and I've never looked back, really.
And you went to Liverpool in the 60s, right? Good time to be there, I'd imagine. And then the University of Illinois, where that's where you did your PhD, wasn't it?
It is, indeed, and a Master of Science, yeah. I don't know why, but when I was a kid, my family were a bit musical. I've always been interested in music. And when I was only 10 or 12, I suddenly was electrified by this new American sound, rock and roll, and whoa. I made a point of seeing all the great, nearly all the great early rock and rollers, and I've got a great fondness for that. So when it came to go to university in 1962, well, it was Liverpool. It had to be.
Did you see the Beatles?
I did. Yeah, absolutely. Went to the various cellar clubs and that. And then I'd run out of steam in Liverpool. I had a great time there. Liverpool was thriving in those days. But, I had to, music. I had to go to the homeland. And so, I'd only been at university there for less than a year, but I'd been to the blues clubs in Chicago, and I'd been to Memphis, I'd been to New Orleans. It was great. So I had a great 6 years in the States, completing a doctorate there. But, when I finished that, the big city thing and all the bright lights, I'd got that out of my system. I'd grown up. I wanted to live in the country. So when I decided I wanted to be an academic, I applied for academic positions in small rural universities. This one at Aberystwyth came up and got the job. I don't suppose I ever...
I didn't move, right?
I've been here nearly 50 years. It's been a great time, really, and I'm still here living out in the country.
That's good to hear. I mean, a lot of your early research, we might call the first part of your career, was spent exploring the way geological sediments deform, right? Especially what you call megafaults, right, where the Earth's tectonic plates converge. I mean, those are earthquake zones, presumably, aren't they? I mean, were you
absolutely
earthquake or not?
Absolutely they are, yes. Something like 80% of the Earth's earthquake energy comes from these zones where one tectonic plate drives underneath another one, what I call megafaults. And according to how they slip, that's whether or not you get earthquakes, very much so.
And can we predict them? Is anybody due one? I mean, Chile or California? I don't want to tempt fate.
What we can do very well is predict where earthquakes are going to be, and it's where these big faults are, active faults at the moment, particularly around the Pacific and across through the Himalayas to the Mediterranean. That's where the earthquakes are going to be, but we can't predict when with sufficient precision to be of any use. So where? Yes. When? No.
So they could happen 2 years running, could they? Or 50 years apart, right?
Oh, yes. I mean, that's fairly trivial on the geological scale of doing things. But for humans, that's not much practical use. But we know where they're going to be, definitely.
You talked about the geological scale, and I'm always wondering what it's like studying something which is, 4.5 billion years old in some ways. But I've always loved the sound of these building blocks. It's a bit like listening to the shipping forecast in the morning. They've got these lovely names. You know what I mean? Devonian, Jurassic, Cambrian, so on. How precise are these building blocks in terms of timescale?
Well, I'm glad you like those names. So do I. And most of them have very interesting stories behind them too. But anyway, we don't have time for that. I think they're very precise. I really do. Don't forget, as you say, the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. But all these names that you know and like are all crammed in the last 0.6 billion years. The first 4 billion years of Earth's history is what we call the Precambrian. It has subdivisions. But all these Jurassics and things, they're all crammed in the last bit. So there's a certain precision straight away. And then, as you'll know, any wine lover will know that the Jurassic, say, is subdivided into intervals like the Oxfordian, the Kimmeridgian, Portlandian. Well, these are subdivisions of the Jurassic, so we're now pretty precise. We're down to, hundreds of thousands of years, maybe less in the more recent periods. And by geological standards, in the context, as you say, of 4.6 billion years, I think that's pretty precise. But can I just add one more thing? It's a bit of a bugbear of mine. This is all good fun, and I love these names too, but they are irrelevant to wine, to vineyards. The vine, as I sometimes put it, the vine doesn't care how many hundreds of millions of years ago the bedrock formed. Might sound good. What the vine cares about is the soil it's growing in, the loose detritus derived from those parent rocks, and almost always that soil is vastly younger than the parent bedrock. In fact, in much of the wine-growing world, it's thousands of years old at most, and is forming now as we speak. Certainly younger than the last ice age, ended 10,000 years ago. So all this stuff about Cambrian and Jurassic sounds good, but it's not of relevance to the growing vine because it's the bedrock, whereas the vine grows in the soil, which is vastly younger.
Because there was a big fight in Chablis, wasn't there, between the Portlandians and the Jurassic, the Kimmeridgian schools. Some people saying, I'm on Kimmeridgian line.
There was. It's all a bit misguided, to be honest. And then another thing, if I can add this, say on the slopes at Chablis, the soil falls down the hill through time. And for centuries, the growers have carted, literally, the soil at the bottom back up the slope and to join stuff coming down from the Portland at the top. So the actual growing soil is a bit of a jumble, really. This idea that it's got to be Kimmeridgian, which is just a period of time anyway, it's all a little bit misdirected.
Interesting. You're a vine grower yourself. Just tell us about the vineyard. Where is it? And what have you got it planted with? It's in Wales, obviously, but you see it from your bedroom window.
It's in my garden. When I moved here, part of the point was to buy a small farm property, which I did with a bit of land. So I know you're going to ask me, how many hectares of vines do I have? Well, I have 20 vines. But my tenet is that whether you have 20 vines or 20,000, it's the same principles. I have to make the same decisions and choices that the big commercial grower has to make. I have to decide how to trellis, how to prune, how to manage that canopy, when to harvest, how to do it, how to make the wine, what yeast, and do I punch down? All those things are just the same. It's just a matter of scale.
Have you made wine from the grapes?
Yes, I make wine every year.
What are they? Tell us. What have you got? What are the 20 vines?
About half Seyval Blanc and half Bacchus, which I like.
Good. I've got to try this.
But I want to say I've learned so much from doing it, albeit on a tiny scale, trivial scale maybe. You've got to make these choices, and it's taught me so much. So I think I can speak with a little bit of authority about winemaking and stuff because I've done it for a long time.
In action. Tell us about when your interest in what you call the geology of wine, we could call the geology of wine, began, because it wasn't part of your early career, was it?
Oh, no, not as such, no. I think of it in terms of a number of different strands going along that I was unaware of. I've always grown my own fruit and vegetables and then vines, but I always asked questions about why I did it certain ways. So I learned about horticulture, the soil, and how it all worked. When I made wine, I was always questioning, how did that work? I've always loved wine from a very early age and was captivated by the names and the labels. I traveled a lot and always made a point of visiting vineyards, talking to people. And I didn't know it, but I was accumulating knowledge all the time. There certainly was never any plan, no goal for it. It was just having fun, really. It was interest. And all the time, of course, I had the geology. I was on top of that. So when this great fashion suddenly exploded, 20, 30 years ago, to talk about vineyard geology, which is conspicuously absent prior to that, I look at the books I bought in, say, the 1960s, they barely mentioned the soil. Certainly nothing like now. So when this exploded and I saw journalists and promotional people throwing these geological ideas and geological words around, well, no, wait a minute, that's not right. And it suddenly hit me that perhaps unusually, because of all these strands coming together, well, I know about this stuff, and I can tell people how it works and let them respond as they will. And suddenly I thought, well, vineyard geology, I can do it. And I don't think there are too many people that are on top of all the relevant strands. They're geologists, but they've not made wine and so on. So really the answer to your question is 20, 30 years ago, when this general interest in wine geology suddenly became fashionable.
And you were well placed, obviously, as a distinguished academic.
Well, exactly, but I just, by serendipity, it was never a plan. And so I thought, well, I've got to show the evidence and let people make of it what I've always been careful not to preach or say, you're wrong. This is the evidence. This is the way, as I see it, vines grow and interact with the soil and so on. There we go. You make of it what you will.
Yeah, and I think you do it very gently, I must say. I mean, we've got a quick plug for your book because it's brilliant, which is Vineyards, Rocks and Soils, The Wine Lover's Guide to Geology. Guys, if you haven't got that book, it's absolutely brilliant. One thing I want to ask you, you've got this tremendous academic background. Do you ever get a sense when you're in a vineyard that you sense how good the vineyard is going to be? Do you have a sixth sense in that sense, or do you need to look at the science before you can say, yes, this is a place that will produce?
No, I don't have a sixth sense. No. As we may come into this, but I think so important for the success of a vineyard is the climate, the right mix of climatic factors. Well, of course, you can't see that. No, I have nothing more than say you have about that. No.
And just give us a geologist's definition of terroir. I mean, the French always say terroir. They say there's no English word for it. I mean, is there an English word, or is there an English phrase that captures it, do you think?
No, I don't think there is, no. To me, terroir is self-evident. As I mentioned, I've grown my own crops for ages, and I've always known that some crops do better in a certain spot than another one year on year. And that, as I see it, is the coming together of all the different factors that influence the growing crop. And it's neatly summed up in this single word, terroir. I think there are two issues. One is that some people insist on equating terroir with the French word terre, the soil, the ground. Well, if it's the same, we don't need the word terroir. It's not the same. The terroir, to me, is the sum total of all the relevant factors, including the technical sounding ones and the ones we can't see. And that's the beauty of the term. But I think equating with soil, that's a red herring. The other thing is that it's tempting to try and deconstruct all the factors that are involved in terroir and what's more important than that. I think that's invidious because there are so many factors dynamically interacting all the time throughout the day, throughout the season, varying in relative importance and mutually interacting. That's just a fearsome thing to try and disentangle. So that's the beauty of the single word terroir. It sums it all up, the properties of a site, in a single word.
And geology is obviously part of that, and so is the human factor, isn't it? It's you out there pruning your little bacchus plants.
Yeah,
right?
Well, yes, potentially, yes. That's a grey area, I think. Yeah, maybe. I think it's these invisible factors that are critically working all the time, and we tend to sideline them. Although we know many climatic things are important for how a grape ripens and so on, but and increasingly we know that microbiology, the yeasts and bacteria in the soil and how they interact with yeasts in the air, that this is important too. But it seems to lack the charisma or something that's saying, oh, the grapes are from granite or from volcanic soils or something. So that's what people write about. Even though it's not demonstrated that it's of any particular importance. And the technical factors, well, they tend to be forgotten.
Yeah. But let's talk a little bit more about geology. I mean, every basic introduction you read talks about the three types of rocks: igneous, sedimentary, metamorphic. Can you just give us a quick overview of the differences between them? And are those differences always as clear-cut as books tell you? 'Cause there are grey areas there, aren't there?
Oh, yes. That's a great question, Tim, because at first glance, and certainly if you just go to Google or something, well, it seems all clear-cut. Igneous rocks, you're right, we divide rocks into three types. Igneous rocks are those that were once molten. Sedimentary rocks are those that were sedimented, deposited, usually underwater, under the sea, built up in layers on the seafloor. And if either of those rocks, through geological time, finds themselves in new conditions of temperature and pressure through burial, then they change in response. And those changed rocks we call metamorphic rocks. So dead simple, but it isn't. Because rocks, like many other things in the earth, are very difficult to categorize. And the early geologists struggled for a century or two trying to classify rocks, all the obvious things like what color are they, or what are their physical properties, what's the chemistry of them. It didn't, for various reasons, work and take us anywhere. And it was not until about 1860, I think, that somebody came up with the classification we do use. But if you think about it, it's a very strange one because it's based on how rocks form. And with just a few exceptions, nobody's ever seen a rock form. I mean, one obvious exception is lava. But if you knock that out, well, nobody's ever seen a granite form or a greywacke here or anything like that. We have to interpret it from what we see in the rock. And being interpretive, it's open to disagreement. And there's lots of examples of geologists squabbling about whether this rock was molten and therefore igneous or not. Oh, well, I think it's got this, and it wasn't. No, it wasn't molten. And so there are these grey areas. Now, most rocks fall neatly in the middle of the box, for sure, but there are all sorts of gradational areas at the margins. And so this makes geology quite a tricky thing to understand. It doesn't lend itself to snappy definitions, and particularly if you want some sort of understanding. I'll just give you one quick vineyard type example. In certain parts of the world, you've got slate, except that some geologists call it schist. Well, is it slate? Is it schist? Well, one grades into the other. As temperature and pressure increase, slate can become schist. Well, where do you draw the line? Different geologists, different cultures, say in Germany versus France, draw the line in different places. Well, this really complicates the issue. So you've really got to have the understanding of the processes to understand the problems. So this is one of the big challenges with geology. It doesn't lend itself to putting in boxes and snappy definitions. And this is partly why I think I see so many howlers.
Yeah, we'll come on to that. So your slate could be my schist, is what you're saying, yeah?
Yes, it is, yes, because they're gradational. And so there's an arbitrary line to be drawn. And that's exactly what you see in, say, Priora somewhere. Some people say, oh, it's on slate, and other things say it's on schist. Well, neither are wrong, but you've got two different names. What's going on? Well, it's because of this gradation, and there are countless examples of that.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but rocks are an aggregate of minerals in one sense, aren't they? I just want to ask you about the term minerality. When you read that, does that make your blood boil? Do you think, what are people talking about? It's very fashionable in wine.
No, just one aspect of it makes, I won't say my blood boil, but no, I can see the need for a label for a certain sensation. It's not very clear what the sensation is, whether it's a mouthfeel or a taste or what. But yeah, I get why people want to call something minerality. The thing that I don't like, and the thing I've tried to address my efforts to, is that for demonstrable reasons, it can't be literal. It is not, I would argue, the taste or the aroma or whatever of geological minerals in the soil that have been taken up by the vine and transmitted through the
because the vine can't do
it won't work. A, the minerals don't have any taste or smell. B, vines can't take them up. They can take up dissolved elements as nutrients. They can't take in geological minerals. They're not there in the finished wine. So in no way can it be literal. And that's what I've tried to lay out the reasoning for.
It's a metaphor in a way, yeah?
What it is, I don't know any more than you, Tim. I wouldn't like to say.
Let's talk a little about soil. You did mention it, and particularly about the terms topsoil and subsoil. And I was fascinated reading your book that subsoil doesn't really count as soil, right? Just tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, that's a terminology thing. I think what I meant was that most of the vine roots, and certainly what we call the feeding roots that are taking in the nutrients, are in the topsoil, in the top 60 centimeters, meter maybe, of the soil, if it's there. The only reason that vines send down deeper roots, if they can, if the subsoil allows it, or there are fissures in the bedrock, is to seek water if they need it. They're not getting nutrition from down there. The nutrients are not available because by definition the material hasn't weathered enough. And they're getting the nutrients from the topsoil. And incidentally, in practice, this is something we don't like to talk about very much, they're getting most of their nutrients from the organic part of the soil, the humus, the compost in gardening speak. That's where the nutrients are accessible and easily taken up by the vine. And they're not really getting it from the nutrients from the geology anyway. But it all happens in the top part of the profile.
So the important bit is your topsoil, really, yeah?
Well, it depends. There are places where the topsoil's directly on bedrock, pretty much. Some soil profiles are deep with thick subsoil parts, but the vine isn't making much use of them apart from getting water. The nutrients are coming from the organic rich topsoil, the dark looking compost rich topsoil that's only the top meter or so.
Tell us about some of the kind of classic pairings that we know of. I mean, I just wonder, are some rocks, minerals, sediments, soils better suited to certain grapes than to others? You know, classic pairings would be Syrah and granite in the Northern Rhone, Cabernet Sauvignon gravel in the Medoc, you know, Chardonnay and limestone in Champagne or Burgundy, Merlot and clay in Pomerol.
In a word, no.
Right.
It doesn't really work if you think about it. What the pairings you've just mentioned are, it seems to me, are reflections of the classic European sites that just happen to have a particular geology. So, yeah, people think of the Côte d'Ivoire, granite and so on. No, it just happens to be granite there. Would it be that different if it was anything else? Well, and if you look more closely, Côte Rôtie, for example, is only partly granite. There is schist there and other things. The Hermitage Hill has got loess on it and a bit of limestone on it. It's not all granite, and yet that they are growths of the same status. So I don't think the granite is doing much. And also, if you go elsewhere in the world, unless you're going to take the view, well, the only wines that matter are French, well, you know, you've got Shiraz wines and Syrah wines, you know, top-notch wines from Barossa, say, Paarl, Swartland, South Africa, Yakima in Washington, Hawke's Bay, New Zealand. I mean, these are pretty good Shiraz.
That aren't necessarily on granite, right?
That none of those I've just mentioned are on granite.
Paardeberg, a little bit, yeah, a little bit maybe in the Swartland, but not much. You're right.
Swartland, yes. Well, okay, yes, you're right. You're right. That's
not
true.
Much. You're right. Yeah.
But you know, so I don't really think it works. And why would it work? I could go through the same argument with the other rocks. You know, Riesling and slate.
It's your snappy definitions again, isn't it? People are jumping to these snappy definitions, really. They're taking shortcuts.
Of course, and it sounds good. I get that. I like the romance of it, but that's okay. I'm sorry to spoil the fun, but I feel I have to point out certain things and, you know, make what you want of it.
I mean, you've written that vineyard geology is commonly misunderstood, and you've been telling us why during the podcast. But, I mean, whose fault is it? I mean, has that always been the case? It's interesting you saying that 50 years ago, nobody was mentioning the geology of vineyards, whereas when did that kind of trend start?
Well, I don't know whether or not you agree, Tim, but I think the wine world is very susceptible to trends coming and going. I mean, just a few years ago, it was the winemaker that was everything. Flying winemakers were the thing, you know. We never hear about the winemaker now. It's all in the vineyard. A few years ago, oak was the thing. All you get now, is it oak aged or not? I can remember whole magazine articles about oak, you know, where in the tree was it from? Where in the forest? Which French forest? And all this stuff about oak. And you never hear about that now. That fashion's gone. Whether this vineyard geology thing is a fashion or not remains to be seen. But I am aware that it has blown up, just as with minerality, since about the turn of the millennium, more or less. And, you know, it ticks the right boxes today. Amongst other things, the backlash against anonymous industrialized food stuff. People want provenance. People want to know where things came from. Well, if this wine came from a certain vineyard, and even more than that, you can link it to the soil. Well, I mean, what's more viscerally satisfying than that? You know, it ticks the boxes, and so people go with it. So it's with some sadness I'm arguing, well, no, it's not that important. But, you know, facts are facts as I see it.
Well, I think you talk about it in your book. You say it's also part of a longing to nurture this link between the land and the wine. That's a little bit of what you're talking about, I suppose. Is it PR driven as well? Do you think that wineries have latched?
Oh, absolutely PR driven, absolutely. But, you know, I've touched on some reasons why it happens. And I sometimes think to some extent it's in our genes, because for so long, literally thousands of years, people thought that wine was made from the soil. Certainly plants, vines grew from the soil matter, water, obviously. But what was the rest of the stuff? It was matter drawn from the soil. Therefore, it followed the wine was made from the soil. Aristotle said this, you know, 3,000 years ago. And it's been with us right through to, just a couple of 100 years ago when photosynthesis dawned, and that really plants and wine, not made from the soil at all, it's made from the air, carbon and oxygen in the air and hydrogen and oxygen from the soils. Let's not forget, almost all wine, 99% wine is just carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. So here we are quibbling with these minerals and nutrients with that tiny, tiny bit that's left. It's those bewildering combinations of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen that make all the taste flavor compounds that influence wine, and some of which we're very sensitive to in tiny, tiny amounts. These are the things that give the wine its character. But, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, that doesn't have the romance of saying this is a wine from volcanic soil.
From limestone or something.
Or limestone. Or you can taste the limestone. Limestone has no taste.
It's interesting that, because there are certain people, even well-qualified ones, much better qualified than I am, like Pedro Parra. I don't know if you know his work in Chile and elsewhere. He's appeared on this podcast. He's saying that you get a distinctive set of aromas and flavours from a certain soil type and rock type, certain type of geology. Are you just saying that's rubbish?
Oh, that's
maybe you wouldn't be that blunt. But are you saying we're wrong to see that connection with geology?
Oh, I have great respect for these people of experience and so on. But let's face it, these are claims. They are beliefs. Where's the evidence? And two things strike me. I have been with people I've never met the person you met. I've read some of his stuff. Oh, yes, volcanic soils are so important. Give a certain nuance to a wine, volcanic wines. And I say, okay, I'll present you with a number of anonymous wines that you don't know anything about. You tell me which ones, if any, are from volcanic soils. And we'll have to do it 2 or 3 times to eliminate chance. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I'm busy right now. They shy away from putting it to a true blind test. So what's that all about? And the experiments that have been done scientifically to try and see if a soil signature comes through, none of them have picked up anything. There was a nice experiment a couple of years back in the Netherlands where they had certain cultivars in different soils. And in a second version of the experiment, they had different yeasts. And all the resulting wines, vinified uniformly as far as they could, went to a completely independent panel, actually in Germany, of trained tasters who knew nothing about the experiment and were just asked, can you put these wines into groups with anything common? And they did to some extent. They could recognize some commonality between a particular cultivar and the yeast. There's a whole, these have something in common. Well, these are all made with the same yeast. But what about soil? And that included limestone. Nothing came through with those vines that are being grown on limestone. So for reasons like that, I have to say that these are claims that people make, and they sound good, but I'd be much more convinced if they stood up to testing.
They stood up to science in a way. I mean, when we taste things like wet stones or oyster shells or dried blood, are you saying those are sort of chemical and biochemical things rather?
The biochemical. Yeah, there's a whole raft of flavours, some of which have been given names, that sound as though they're earthy and stony, but in fact are due to bacteria and things. Possibly the best known one is petrichor. This is the well-known smell you get after a shower of rain. If you have a dry period, when it rains, you get this distinctive smell. Oh, it's the earth. Smells earthy, of course, and people, understandably, wine tasters say, I'm getting petrichor. That's okay, but it's a metaphor. It's a reminiscence of that smell. It's not due to the geology, because if you think about it, when you get that smell, it doesn't matter whether you're walking on concrete or tarmac or on rock or on sand, they all give that same smell. It's because it's the organic matter that's in the air all around us that has very quickly settled on the substrate, on the geology, if you like, and filmed it. And it requires that rain. And there's very impressive high-precision video footage of this, of the raindrop landing on that surface. And the stuff turns into an aerosol, gets in the air almost instantly, and we can smell it. But we're smelling these decayed organic products, which have been labeled petrichor in this example. And so when we are saying, I'm getting this wet stone smell or the smell of a struck match or something like that, it's a useful metaphor. We don't need all the metaphors we can get, but it's not literal. It's not the geology we are tasting.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, you also talk about this, and I think you're spot on. You talk about these unseen factors that affect the aromas and flavours of a given wine. You've mentioned some of them. Are there any that you haven't mentioned that are these unseen factors?
No, I don't know about that. So the microbiology has come to the fore in recent years, of course. But I do think climate is the big one. And I think it's often not appreciated that this single word covers a whole raft of factors that we just forget about. I mean, temperature, for example. We know that temperature affects vine growth and grape ripening and the rest of it. So it's a big one. Well, but temperature, do we mean temperature at the vine roots, at the soil surface, where the fruit is? Do we mean an average? Do we mean the midday temperature? Do we mean daily variation or what? So even that one factor, temperature, is in fact a whole load of things. And then that acts with humidity, airflow, which interacts with ultraviolet light penetration, all these things, so technical. But where anyone's taken the time to sense these things and measure them on a fine scale, they've been variable on a much finer scale than we would ever have guessed. There's this temptation to look at a hill slope and say, the climate's the same, so why are these wines consistently different to the soil's different? It's the soil. But whenever anybody has measured these invisible factors, they're varying like nobody's business.
How interesting. One of the things you said, and I think it's typical of you in a sense, that even though you've got this vast fund of knowledge, you said that it's perfectly possible that science is missing something when it comes to wine, and this connection maybe between geology and aroma and flavour. I mean, what might that be? What might it be?
Tim, I've got no idea, and that's the point. That's the whole point, really. I say that partly as a matter of principle, because that comes with science. Science, by definition, is never complete. We're always questioning. It's hard to see how things that have so much evidence are ever going to be overturned, like the Earth being round or something like that. But it could be. Science is always open to question, so there could be something. I said that as a matter of principle, but I also want to underline the fact that I'm not preaching. I'm just relating how things are as I see it. But I'm no religious person saying you're going to go to vinous hell unless you believe what I say. These are the facts as I see it. What do you want to make of it?
And listen to it or not. I mean, people can, I'm sure, hear that you were a brilliant teacher, but you retired from teaching, 20 years ago, I think, but you're still very active. I mean, how do you spend your time now? Writing, travelling, tending your vines, your 20 vines in the back
all garden? All of the above. Yeah, gardening takes quite a lot of time. Yes, I mean, I am trying to wind down a bit. I have to say no to things more often, particularly if they involve travelling. But yeah, I've got family, grandchildren who live abroad, Netherlands and Belgium. So, I go and see them. That takes time with my wife, who incidentally is American. I met her during my time in the States, and she's lived here for 40-odd years. So, yeah, I don't know, with one thing or another, the days seem shorter than they ever were when I was younger.
Is there another book in you?
Yeah, there might be. Tell us more. I better not say any more, but yeah.
You're working on something, are you?
I am writing some stuff, yeah.
Well, listen, we look forward to reading it. Thank you so much for sparing, unbelievable amount of knowledge. I could talk to you for 5 hours, instead of which we've only had 40 minutes, but it's been fascinating to hear your view of geology and how it connects with wine. Thank you very much, Alex.
Tim, my pleasure, absolutely.
We can understand why Alex was such a great teacher. I can listen to him for hours. Next week on Cork Talk, my guest is Adrian Bridge of Taylor's Port. Join me then. Thanks for listening to Cork Talk. If you want to read more reports, articles and tasting notes by me, go to my website, timatkin.com. You can also follow me on Twitter @timatkin and on Instagram @timatkinmw. See you next week.